just embracing the full complexity of just how the variables interact, maybe through simulation, maybe have some interesting models around that.
Wouldn't it be refreshing if somebody for once published a table of the change in price of every product, every service, and every asset in every place over time?
You said table. Some of that also is the task of visualization, how to extract from this complex set of numbers patterns that somehow indicate something fundamental about what's happening. So, like, summarization of data is still important. Perhaps summarization not down to a single scale of value, but looking at that whole sea of numbers, you have to find patterns. Like, what is inflation in a particular sector? What is maybe change over time? Maybe different geographical regions, things of that nature. I think that's kind of, I don't know even what that task is. That's what you could look at machine learning. You can look at AI with that perspective, which is like, how do you represent what's happening as efficiently as possible? That's never going to be a single number, but it might be a compressed model that captures something beautiful, something fundamental about what's happening.
It's an opportunity for sure, right? You know, if we take, for example, during the pandemic, the response of the political apparatus was to lower interest rates to zero and to start buying assets, in essence, printing money. And the defense was there's no inflation.
Yeah.
But of course, you had one part of the economy where it was locked down, so it was illegal to buy anything. Like you couldn't, it was either illegal or it was impractical. So it would be impossible for demand to manifest. So of course there is no inflation. On the other hand, there was instantaneous, immediate inflation in another part of the economy. For example, you lowered the interest rates to zero. At one point, we saw the swap rate on a 30-year note go to 72 basis points. Okay, that means that the value of a long-dated bond immediately inflates. So the bond market had hyperinflation within minutes of these financial decisions. The asset market had hyperinflation. We had what you call a K-shaped recovery, what we affectionately call a K-shaped recovery. We recovered all within 6 weeks. The inflation was in the assets, like in the stocks, in the bonds. If you look today, you see that typical house, according to the Case-Shiller index today, is up 19.2% year over year. So if you're a first-time home buyer, the inflation rate is 19%. The formal CPI announced is 7.9%. You can pretty much create any inflation rate you want by constructing a market basket, right? A weighted basket of products or services or assets that yield you the answer. I think that, the fundamental failing of economists is first of all, they don't really have a term for asset inflation, right?
What's asset hyperinflation? You mentioned bond market, swap rate, and asset is where the majority of the hyperinflation happened.
Yeah.
What's inflation? What's hyperinflation? What's an asset? What's an asset market? I'm going to ask so many dumb questions.
In the conventional economic world, you would treat inflation as the rate of increase in price of a market basket of consumer products, defined by a government agency.
So they have traditional things that a regular consumer would be buying. The government selects like toilet paper, food, toaster, refrigerator, electronics, all that kind of stuff, and it's like a representative basket of goods that lead to a content existence on this earth for a regular consumer.
They define a synthetic metric, right? I mean, I'm going to say you should have 1,000 square foot apartment and you should have a used car and you should eat, 3 hamburgers a week. Now, 10 years go by and the apartment costs more. I could adjust the market basket by they call them hedonic adjustments. I could decide that It used to be in 1970 you needed 1,000 square feet, but in the year 2020 you only need 700 square feet because we've miniaturized televisions and we've got more efficient electric appliances, and because things have collapsed into the iPhone, you just don't need as much space. So now it may be that the apartment costs 50% more, but after the hedonic adjustment, there is no inflation because I just downgraded the expectation of what a normal person should have.
So the synthetic nature of the metric allows for manipulation by people in power.
Pretty much. I guess my criticism of economists is, rather than embracing inflation based upon its fundamental idea, which is the rate at which the price of things go up, right? They've been captured by mainstream conventional thinking to immediately equate inflation to the government issued CPI or government issued PCE or government issued PPI measure, which was never the rate at which things go up. It's simply the rate at which a synthetic basket of products and services the government wishes to track go up. Now, the problem with that is two big things. One thing is the government gets to create the market basket, and so they keep changing what's in the basket over time. So, I mean, if I said 3 years ago you should go see 10 concerts a year, and the concert tickets now cost $200 each, now it's $2,000 a year to go see concerts. Now I'm in charge of calculating inflation, so I redefine, your entertainment quota for the year to be 8 Netflix streaming concerts, and now they don't cost $2,000; they cost nothing, and there is no inflation. But you don't get. The problem starts with continually changing the definition of the market basket. But in my opinion, that's not the biggest problem. The more egregious problem is the fundamental idea that assets aren't products or services. Assets can't be inflated.
What's an asset?
A house, a share of Apple stock, a bond, a Bitcoin is an asset. Or a Picasso painting. So,
not a consumable good, not not an apple that you can eat.
Right. If I throw away an asset, then I'm not on the hook to track the inflation rate for it. So, what happens if I change the policy such that, let's take the classic example: $1 million bond at a 5% interest rate gives you $50,000 a year in risk-free income. You might retire on $50,000 a year in a low-cost jurisdiction. So the cost of Social Security or early retirement is $1 million when the interest rate is 5%. During the crisis of March of 2020, the interest rate went on a 10-year bond went to 50 basis points. The cost of that bond is $10 million. Okay, the cost of Social Security went from $1 million to $10 million. So if you wanted to work your entire life, save money, and then retire risk-free and live happily ever after on a $50,000 salary, living on a beach in Mexico, wherever you wanted to go, you had hyperinflation. The cost of your aspiration increased by a factor of 10 over the course of, some amount of time. In fact, in that case, that was like over the course of about 12 years, right? As the inflation rate ground down, the asset traded up. But the conventional view is, oh, that's not a problem because it's good that it's good that the bond is highly priced because we own the bond. Or what's the problem with the inflation rate in housing being 19%? It's an awful problem for a 22-year-old that's starting their first job, that's saving money to buy a house. But it would be characterized as a benefit to society by a conventional economist who would say, well, housing asset values are higher because of interest rate fluctuation, and now the economy's got more wealth. And so that's
Right.
That's viewed as a benefit.
So what's being missed here, like the suffering of the average person, or the struggle, the suffering, the pain of the average person, like metrics that captured that within the economic system. Is it when you're talking about
One way to say it is a conventional view of inflation as CPI understates the human misery that's inflicted upon the working class and on mainstream companies by the political class. And so it's a massive shift of wealth from the working class to the propertied class. It's a massive shift of power from the free market to the centrally governed or the controlled market. It's a massive shift of power from the people to the government. And maybe one more illustrative point here, Lex, is what do you think the inflation rate's been for the past 100 years?
Are we talking about the scalar again?
If you took a survey of everybody on the street and you asked them what do they think inflation was, what is it? You remember when Jerome Powell said our target's 2%, but we're not there.
Mhm.
If you go around the corner, I have posted the deed to this house sold in 1930. Okay, and the number on that deed is $100,000, 1930. And if you go on Zillow
Mhm.
and you get the Z estimate,
Is it higher than that? No.
$30,500,000.
Yeah.
So that's 92 years, 1930 or 2022. And in 92 years, we've had 305x increase in price of the house. Now, if you actually back calculate, you come to a conclusion that the inflation rate was approximately 6.5% a year, every year, for 92 years. Okay, and there's nobody in government, no conventional economist that would ever admit to an inflation rate of 7% a year in the US dollar over the last century. Now, if you dig deeper, I mean, one guy that's done a great job working on this is Seyfedin Amos, who wrote the book, The Bitcoin Standard, and he notes that on average, it looks like the inflation rate and the money supply is about 7% a year, all the way up to the year 2020. If you look at the S&P index, which is a market basket of scarce desirable stocks, it returned about 10%. If you talk to 10% a year for 100 years, the money supply is expanding at 7% 100 years. If you actually talk to economists or you look at the economy and you ask the question, how fast does the economy grow in its entirety year over year? Generally about 2 to 3%. Like the sum total impact of all this technology and human ingenuity might get you a 2.5%, 3% improvement a year.
As measured by GDP. Is that are you okay with that?
I'm not sure I'd go that far yet, but I would just say that if you had the human race doing stuff,
yeah,
and if you ask the question, how much more efficiently will we do the stuff next year than this year, or what's the value of all of our innovations and inventions and investments, you'd be hard pressed to say we get 2% better. Typical investor thinks they're 10% better every year. So if you look at what's going on, really, when you're holding $1 million of stocks and you're getting a 10% gain a year, you really get a 7% expansion of the money supply. You're getting a 2 or 3% gain under best circumstances. And another way to say that is, if the money supply stopped expanding at 7% a year, the S&P yield might be 3% and not 10%. It probably should be. Now that gets you to start to ask a bunch of other fundamental questions, like if I borrow $1 billion and pay 3% interest and the money supply expands at 7 to 10% a year, and I ended up making a 10% return on a $1 billion investment paying 3% interest, is that fair? And who suffered so that I could do that? Because in an environment where you're just inflating the money supply and you're holding the assets constant, it stands to reason that the price of all the assets is going to appreciate somewhat proportional to the money supply. And the difference in asset appreciations is going to be a function of the scarce desirable quality of the assets, and to what extent can I make more of them, and to what extent are they truly limited in supply.
Yeah, so we'll get to a lot of the words you said there, the scarcity, and so connected to how limited they are and the value of those assets. But you also said so the expansion of the money supply, which is put another way, is printing money. And so is that always bad? The expansion of the money supply is this just to put some terms on the table so we understand them. Um, you nonchalantly say it's always the on average expanding every year. The money supply is expanding every year by 7%. That's a bad thing. That's universally a bad thing.
It's awful. Well, I guess to be precise, it's the currency that I mean, money. I would say money is monetary energy or economic energy, and the economic energy has to find its way into a medium. So, if you want to move it rapidly as a medium of exchange, it has to find its way into currency. But the money can also flow into property, like a house or gold. If the money flows into property, it'll probably hold its value much better. If the money flows into currency, right? If you had put $100,000 in this house, you would have 305x return over 92 years. But if you had put the money, $100,000 in a safe deposit box and buried it in the basement, you would have lost 99.7% of your wealth over the same time period. So the expansion of the currency creates a massive inefficiency in the society, what I'll call an adiabatic lapse. It's what we're doing is we're bleeding the civilization to death,
What's
right?
the anabatic? Adiabatic? What's that word? That's
Adiabatic lapse. Okay,
adiabatic.
right? In aerospace engineering, you want to solve any problem, they start with the phrase assume an adiabatic system. And what that means is a closed system.
Okay,
So I've
got it.
I've got a container, and in that container, no air leaves and no air enters, no energy exits or enters. So it's a closed system. The blood from your body you can't perform. If you adiabatic lapse is when you go up in altitude. Every 1,000 feet, you lose 3 degrees.
Mhm.
You go 50,000 feet, you're 50,000 feet, you're 150 degrees colder than sea level. That's why you look at your instruments and instead of 80 degrees, you're minus 70 degrees. Why is the temperature falling? Temperature's falling because it's not a closed system, it's an open system. As the air expands, the density falls, right? The energy per per cubic whatever falls, and therefore the temperature falls, right? The heat's falling out of the solution. So when you're inflating, let's say you're inflating the currency supply by 6%, you're sucking 6% of the energy out of the fluid that the economy is using to function.
So the currency, this kind of ocean of currency, that's a nice way for the economy to function. It's the most kind of it's being inefficient when you expand the money supply, but it's the liquid. I'm trying to find the right kind of adjective here. It's how you do transactions at a scale of billions.
Currency is the asset we use to
Yeah.
move monetary energy around, and you could use the dollar, or you could use the peso, or you could use the bolivar.
Selling houses and buying houses is much more inefficient. Or like you can't transact between billions of people with houses.
Yeah, properties don't make such good mediums of exchange. They make better stores of value, and they have utility value if it's a ship or a house or a plane or a bushel of corn, right?
Can I zoom out just for?
Yeah.
Can we zoom out? Keep zooming out until we reach the origin of human civilization. But on the way, ask. You gave economists a D minus. I'm not even going to ask you what you give to governments. Uh, do you think their failure, economists and government failure, is malevolence or incompetence?
I think policymakers are well intentioned, but generally all government policy is inflationary, and all government it's inflammatory and inflationary. So what I mean by that is, when you have a policy pursuing uh, supply chain independence, if you have an energy policy, if you have a labor policy, if you have a trade policy, if you have a any kind of foreign policy, a domestic policy, a manufacturing policy, every one of these, a medical policy, every one of these policies interferes with the free market and generally prevents some rational actor from doing it in a cheaper, more efficient way. So when you layer them on top of each other, they all have to be paid for. If you want to shut down the entire economy for a year, you have to pay for it, right? If you want to fight a war, you have to pay for it, right? If you don't want to use oil or natural gas, you have to pay for it. If you don't want to manufacture semiconductors in China and you want to manufacture them in the US, you got to pay for it. If I rebuild the entire supply chain in Pennsylvania and I hire a bunch of employees and then I unionize the employees, then not only am I idle the factory in the Far East, it goes to 50% capacity. So whatever it sells, it has to raise the price on. And then I drive up the cost of labor for every other manufacturer in the US because I'm competing against them, right? I'm changing the conditions. So everything gets less efficient, everything gets more expensive. And of course, the government couldn't really pay for its policies and its wars with taxes. We didn't pay for World War I with tax. We didn't pay for World War II with tax. We didn't pay for Vietnam with tax. In fact, when you trace this, what you realize is the government never pays for all of its policies with tax.
Because it's too painful to ask to raise the taxes to truly transparently pay for the things you're doing with taxes, with taxpayer money, because they feel the pain.
That's one interpretation, or it's just too transparent. If people understood the true cost
of war, they wouldn't want to go to war.
If you were told that you would lose 95% of your assets, and 90% of everything you will be taken from you, you might reprioritize your thought about a given policy and you might not vote for that politician.
But you're still saying incompetence, not malevolence. So fundamentally, government creates a bureaucracy of incompetence is kind of how you look at it.
I think a lack of humility, right? Like if people had more humility, then they would realize
humility about how little they know, how little they understand about the function of complex systems.
There's a phrase from Clint Eastwood's movie Unforgiven where he says a man's got to know his limitations. I think that a lot of people overestimate what they can accomplish, and experience in life causes you to reevaluate that. So I've done a lot of things in my life, and generally my mistakes were always my good ideas that I enthusiastically pursued, to the detriment of my great ideas that required 150% of my attention to prosper. So I think people pursue too many good ideas. They all sound good, but there's just a limit to what you can accomplish. And everybody underestimates the challenges of implementing an idea, right? And they always overestimate the benefits of the pursuit of that. And so I think it's an overconfidence that causes an overexuberance in pursuit of policies. And as the ambition of the government expands, so the amount of manufacturing capacity in the said economy. And it doesn't triple the amount of assets in the economy, it just triples the pesos. So as you increase the currency supply, and the price of all those scarce desirable things will tend to go up rapidly. And the confidence of all of the institutions, the corporations, and individual actors and trading partners will collapse.
If we take a tangent on a tangent, we will return soon to the big human civilization question. So if government naturally wants to buy stuff it can't afford, what's the best form of government? Anarchism, libertarianism. So there's not even armies. There's no borders. That's anarchism. The smallest possible. The smallest possible. The best government would be the least, and the debate will be over
that.
When you think about this stuff, do you think about, okay, government is the way it is. I, as a person that can generate great ideas, how do I operate in this world? Or do you also think about the big picture? If we start a new civilization somewhere on Mars, do you think about like what's the ultimate form of government? What's at least a promising thing to try?
You know, I have laser eyes on my profile on
Yes,
Twitter,
we've
Lex.
noticed. What does that mean?
And the
What's it?
significance of laser eyes is to focus on the thing that
Yes,
can make a difference.
yes.
And if I look at the civilization, I would say half the problems in the civilization are due to the fact that our understanding of economics and money is defective. Half, 50%. I don't know, it's worth $500 trillion worth of problems. Like money, money represents all the economic energy in the civilization, and it kind of equates to all the products, all the services, and all the assets that we have and we're ever going to have. So that's half. The other half of the problems in the civilization are medical and military and political and philosophical and and natural.
Hmm.
And I think that there are a lot of different solutions to all those problems, and they are all honorable professions, and they all merit a lifetime of consideration for the specialist in all those areas. I think that what I could offer it's constructive is um, inflation is completely misunderstood. It's a much bigger problem than we understand it to be. We need to introduce engineering and science techniques into economics if we want to further the human condition.
Hmm.
All government policy is inflationary, and another pernicious myth is inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomena. So, a famous quote by Milton Friedman, I believe, it's like, it's a monetary phenomena. That is, inflation comes from expanding the currency supply, non-inflationary. If I never printed another dollar, and if I eliminated fractional reserve banking from the face of the earth, we'd still have inflation. And we'd have inflation as long as we have government that is capable of pursuing any kind of policies that are in themselves inflationary, and generally they all are.
So in general, inflationary is the big characteristic of human nature that governments, collection of groups that have power over others and allocate other people's resources, will try to intentionally or not hide the costs of those allocations, like in some
Well,
tricky ways,
hi,
whatever the options ever available.
hiding the cost is like the tertiary thing. Like the primary goal is the government will attempt to do good, right?
That's the primary problem.
They will attempt to do good, and they will do it. They will do good imperfectly, and they will create oftentimes as much damage, more damage than the good they do. Most government policy will be iatrogenic. It will create more harm than good in the pursuit of it, but it is what it is. The secondary issue is they will unintentionally pay for it by expanding the currency supply without realizing that they're actually paying for it in a suboptimal fashion. They'll collapse their own currencies while they attempt to do good. The tertiary issue is they will mismeasure how badly they're collapsing the currency. So, for example, if you go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and look at the numbers printed by the Fed, they'll say, "Oh, it looks like the dollar has lost 95% of its purchasing power over 100 years." Okay, they sort of fess up that there's a problem, but they make it 95% loss over 100 years. What they don't do is realize it's a 99.7% loss over 80 years. So they will mismeasure just the horrific extent of the monetary policy in pursuit. The mental models that they use that are conventionally taught are wrong, right? The mental model that, like, it's okay, we can print all this money because the velocity of the money is low, right? Because money velocity is a scalar and inflation is a scalar, and we don't see 2% inflation yet, and the money velocity is low, and so it's okay if we print trillions of dollars. Well, the money velocity was immediate, right? The velocity of money through the crypto economy is 10,000 times faster than the velocity of money through the consumer economy, right? It's, I think Nick pointed out when you spoke to him, he said it takes 2 months for a credit card transaction to settle, right? So you want to spend $1 million in the consumer economy, you can move it 6 times a year. You put $1 million into gold, gold will sit in a vault for a decade. Okay, so the velocity of money through gold is 0.1. You put the money in the stock market and you can trade it once a week. The settlement is T plus 2. Maybe you get to 2-to-1 leverage. You might get to a money velocity of 100 a year. The economists don't understand economics because if they did, they would be creating multivariate computer simulations where they actually put in the price of every piece of housing in every city in the world, the full array of foods and the full array of products and the full array of assets. And then on a monthly basis, they would publish all those results. And that's a high bandwidth requirement. And I think that people don't really want to embrace it. And also there's the most pernicious thing, like there's that phrase, you can't tell people what to think, but you can tell them what to think about. The most pernicious thing is I get you to misunderstand the phenomena so that even when it's happening to you, you don't appreciate that it's a bad thing and you think it's a good thing. So if housing prices are going up 20% year over year, and I say this is great for the American public because most of them are homeowners, then I've misrepresented financial costs.
It does seem that the cruder the model, whether it's economics, whether it's psychology, the easier it is to weave whatever the heck narrative you want, and not in a malicious way, but just like it's some kind of like emergent phenomena, this narrative thing that we tell ourselves. So you can tell any kind of story about inflation. Inflation is good, inflation is bad. Like the cruder the model, the easier it is to tell a narrative about it. And that's what so like if you take an engineering approach, I feel like it becomes more and more difficult to run away from sort of a true deep understanding of the dynamics of the system.
I mean, honestly, if you went to 100 people on the street and you asked them to define inflation, how many would say it's a vector tracking the change in price of every product, service, asset in the world over time?
No,
not many.
not
Now,
many.
if you went to them and you said, do you think 2% inflation a year is good or bad? The majority would probably say, well, here it's good.
Yeah.
The majority of economists would say 2% inflation a year is good. And a 100-year life, 100 would be long, 50 years, not unlikely. So when we built ships out of wood, they had a useful life of about 50 years, and then they sunk, they rotted. There's nothing good about it, right? You build a ship out of steel, and it's zero as opposed to 2% degradation. And how much better is 0% versus 2%? Well, 2% means you have a useful life of, it's half-life of 35 years. 2% is a half-life of 35 years. That's basically the half-life of money in gold. If I store your life force in gold, under perfect circumstances, you have a useful life of 35 years. 0% is a useful life of forever. So 0% is immortal. 2% is 35 years average life expectancy. So the idea that you would think the life expectancy of the currency and the civilization should be 35 years instead of forever is kind of a superpower. Our currency lost 99.7% of its value. And that means horrifically, every other currency lost everything, right? In essence, the other ones were 99.9, except for most that were 100% because they all completely failed. And you've got a mainstream economic community, that thinks that inflation is a number and 2% is desirable. It's kind of like, remember George Washington, how he died?
No.
Well-meaning physicians bled him to death.
Hmm.
Okay. The last thing in the world you would want to do to a sick person is bleed them, right? In the modern world, I think we understand that oxygen is carried by the blood cells, and and if there's that phrase, right? A triage phrase. What's the first thing you do in an injury? Stop the bleeding.
Mhm.
Single first thing, right? You show up after any action. I look at you, stop the bleeding, because you're going to be dead in a matter of minutes if you bleed out. So it strikes me as being ironic that orthodox conventional wisdom was bleed the patient to death. And this was the most important patient in the country, maybe in the history of the country. And we bled him to death, trying to help him. So when you're actually inflating the money supply at 7%, but you're calling it 2% because you want to help the economy, you're literally bleeding the free market to death. But the sad fact is George Washington went along with it because he thought that they were going to do him good. And the majority of the society, most companies, most conventional thinkers, the working class, they go along with this because they think that someone has their best interest at mind. And the people that are bleeding them to death believe they believe that prescription because their mental models are just so defective, and their understanding of energy and engineering and the economics that are at play is crippled by these mental models.
But that's both the bug and the feature of human civilization, that ideas take hold, they unite us, we believe in them, and we make a lot of cool stuff happen by, as an average sort of, just the fact of the matter, a lot of people believe the same thing. They get together and they get some shit done because they believe that thing. And then some ideas can be really bad and really destructive, but on average, the ideas seem to be progressing in a direction of good. Let me just step back. What the hell are we doing here, us humans on this earth? How do you think of humans? How special are humans? How did human civilization originate on this earth? And what is this human project that we're all taking on? You mentioned fire and water, and apparently bleeding you to death is not a good idea. I always thought you can to solve problems or just build incredible, cool things.
Engineering, harnessing energy and technique to make the world a better place than you found it. Right? From the point that we actually started to play with fire, right? That was a big leap forward. Harnessing the power of kinetic energy and missiles, another step forward. Every city built on water. Why water? Well, water's bringing energy, right? If you actually put a turbine, on a river, or you capture a change in elevation of water, you've literally harnessed gravitational energy. But water is also bringing you food. It's also giving you, a cheap form of getting rid of your waste. It's also giving you free transportation. You want to move 1-ton blocks around. You want to move them in water. So the human story is really of engineering. The aqueducts are a great example. If you go to any big city, you travel through cities in the Med, you find that, the carrying capacity of the city or the island is 5,000 people without running water. And then if you can find a way to bring water to it, it increases by a factor of 10. And so human flourishing is really only possible through that channeling of energy, right? That eventually takes the form of air power, right? That ship, look at the intricacy of those sails, right? just the model is intricate. Now think about all of the experimentation that took place to figure out how many sails to put on that ship and how to rig them and how to repair them and how to operate them.
There's thousands of lives spent thinking through all the tiny little details, all to increase the efficiency of this, the effectiveness, the efficiency of this ship as it sails through water. And we should also note there's a bunch of cannons to serve a useful purpose if you look at Earth as a whole. We, as humans, now like to think of violence as really a bad thing. It seems to be one of the amazing things about humans is we're ultimately tend towards cooperation. We like peace. If you just look at history, we want things to be nice and calm, and but just wars break out every once in a while and lead to immense suffering and destruction and so on. And they have a kind of like resetting the palette effect. It's one that's full of just immeasurable human suffering, but it's like a way to start over.
We're clearly the apex predator on the planet. And I Googled something the other day, what's the most common form of mammal life on the Earth?
By number of organisms?
Count.
By count.
And the answer that came back was human beings. I was shocked. I couldn't believe it, right? It says like, apparently, if we're just looking at mammals, the answer was human beings are the most common, which was very interesting to me. I almost didn't believe it, but I was trying to, 8 billion or so human beings.
It's a lot.
There's no other mammal that's got more than 8 billion. If you walk through downtown Edinburgh and Scotland and you look up on this hill and this castle up on the hill, and you talk to people, and the story is, oh yeah, well that was a British castle before it was a Scottish castle, before it was a Pict castle, before it was a Roman castle, before it was some other Celtic castle, before it was then they found 13 prehistoric castles buried one under the other. And you get to conclusion that 100,000 years ago, somebody showed up and grabbed the high point, the apex of the city, and they built a stronghold there, and they flourished, and their family flourished, and their tribe flourished until someone came along and knocked them off the hill. And it's been a nonstop, never-ending fight by the aggressive, most powerful entity, family, organization, municipality, tribe, whatever.
All for the hill.
For that one hill, going back since time immemorial. And, you scratch your head and you think, it seems like it's like just this never-ending
But doesn't that lead,
wheel.
if you just, all kinds of metrics, that seems to improve the quality of our cannons and ships as a result. Like it seems that war, just like your laser eyes, focuses the mind on the engineering tasks.
It is that, and it does remind you that the winner is always the most powerful. And we throw that phrase out, but no one thinks about what that phrase means. Like who's the most powerful, or the most powerful side won, but they don't think about it. And they think about power, energy delivered in a period of time. And then you think a guy with a spear is more powerful than someone with their fist, and someone with a bow and arrow is more powerful than the person with the spear. And then you realize that somebody with bronze is more powerful than without, and steel is more powerful than bronze. Slings thousands of years ago, they could have stood off 500 meters and put a hole in your head, right? And so there was never a time when humanity wasn't vying to come up with an asymmetric form of projecting their own power via technology.
And absolute power is when a leader is able to control a large amount of humans that are facing the same direction, working in the same direction to leverage energy.
The most organized society wins.
Yeah.
When the Romans were dominating everybody, they were the most organized civilization in Europe, and as long as they stayed organized, they dominated. And at some point, they overexpanded and got disorganized, and they collapsed. And I guess you could say that, the struggle of the human condition, it catalyzes the development of new technologies one after the other. It penalizes anybody that rejects ocean power, right, gets penalized. You reject artillery, you get penalized. You reject atomic power, you get penalized. If you reject digital power, cyber power, you get penalized. And the underlying control of the property keeps shifting hands from
A few good and companies, once they get a few good ideas, they seem to stick with them. They reject new ideas. It's almost whether that's emergent or however that evolved, it seems to have a really interesting effect, because when you're young, you fight for the new ideas, you push them through, then a few of us humans find success, then we get complacent, we take over the world using that new idea, and then the new young person with the better new idea challenges you, and you as opposed to pivoting, you stick with the old and lose because of it. And that's how empires collapse. And it's just both at the individual level that happens when two academics fighting about ideas or something like that, and at the human civilization level, governments, they hold on to the ideas of old. It's fascinating.
an ever persistent theme in the history of science is the paradigm shift. And the paradigms shift when the old guard dies and a new generation arrives, or the paradigm shifts when there's a war and everyone that disagrees with the idea of aviation finds bombs dropping on their head, or everyone that disagrees with whatever your technology is has a rude awakening. And if they totally disagree, their society collapses and they're replaced by that new thing.
A lot of the engineering you talked about had to do with ships and cannons and leveraging water. What about this whole digital thing that's been happening over the past century? Is that still engineering in your mind? You're starting to operate in these bits of information.
I think there's two big ideas. The first wave of ideas were digital information, and that was the internet wave, been running since 1990 or so, for 30 years. And the second wave is digital energy. So if I look at digital information, this idea that we want to digitally transform a book, I'm going to dematerialize every book in this room into bits, and then I'm going to deliver a copy of the entire library to 1 billion people, and I'm going to do it for pretty much de minimis electricity. If I can dematerialize music, books, education, entertainment, maps, right? That is an incredibly like exothermic transaction. It's a crystallization when we collapse into a lower energy state as a civilization, and we give off massive amounts of energy. Like if you look at what Carnegie did, the richest man in the world created libraries everywhere at the time, and he gave away his entire fortune. And now we can give a better library to every 6-year-old for nothing. And so what's the value of giving 1 million books to 8 billion people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's the explosion in prosperity that comes from digital transformation. And when we do it with maps, I transform the map, I put it into a car, you get in the car and the car drives you where you want to go with the map, right? And how much better is that than a Rand McNally Atlas right here? It's like 1 million times better.
Yeah.
So the first wave of digital transformation was the dematerialization of all of these informational things which are non-conservative. That is, I could take Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, played for by the best orchestra in Germany, and I could give it to 1 billion people and they could play it 1,000 times each at less than the cost of the one performance, right? So I deliver culture and education and erudition and intelligence and insight to the entire civilization over digital rails. And the consequences of the human race are first order, generally good, right? The world is a better place. It drives growth. And you create these trillion-dollar entities like Apple and Amazon and Facebook and Google and Microsoft. right? That is the first wave. The second wave,
Do you mind? I'm sorry to interrupt, but that
yeah,
first wave, um, it feels like the impact that's positive. You said the first order impact is generally positive. It feels like it's positive in a way that nothing else in history has been positive. And then we may not actually truly be able to understand the orders of magnitude of increase in productivity and just progress of human civilization until we look back centuries from now. It just feels, or maybe I'm like just looking at the impact of Wikipedia,
right.
the giving access to basic wisdom or basic knowledge, and then perhaps wisdom to billions of people. If you can just linger on that for a second, what's your sense of the impact of that?
You know, I would say if you're a technologist, philosopher, the impact of a technology is so much greater on the civilization and the human condition than a non-technology that it's almost not worth your trouble to bother trying to fix things a conventional way. So let's take an example. Um, I have a foundation, the Sailor Academy, and the Sailor Academy gives away free education, free college education to anybody on earth that wants it. And we've had more than 1 million students. And if you go and you take the physics class, the lectures were by the same physics lecturer that taught me physics at MIT. Except when I was at MIT, the cost of the first 4 weeks of MIT would have drained my family's collective life savings for the last 100 years.
Yeah.
Like 100 years worth of my father, my grandfather, my great grandfather. They saved every penny they had after 100 years. They could have paid for 1 week or 2 weeks of MIT.
Yeah.
That's how fiendishly expensive and inefficient it was. So
Yes.
I went on scholarship. I was lucky to have a scholarship. But on the other hand, I sat in the back of on your iPad or watching on your computer and rewind it multiple times and sit in a comfortable chair, and you can do it from anywhere on earth, and it's absolutely free. So I think about this and I think, you want to improve the human condition? You need people with postgraduate level education. You need PhDs. And I know this sounds kind of elitist, but you want to cure cancer and you want to go to the stars, fusion drive. We need new propulsion, right? We need extraordinary breakthroughs in every area of basic science, be it biology or propulsion or materials science or computer science. You're not doing that with an undergraduate degree. You're certainly not doing it with a high school education. But the cost of a PhD is like $1 million. There's like 10 million PhDs in the world. If you check it out, there's 8 billion people in the world. How many people could get a PhD or would want to? Maybe not 8 billion, but a billion, 500 million. Let's just say 500 million to a billion. How do you go from 10 million to a billion? Highly $1 million a person? I can do it that way. And you're never, even if you had $1 trillion, if you had $10 trillion to throw at the problem, and we've just thrown $10 trillion at certain problems, you don't solve the problem, right? If I put $10 trillion on the table and I said, educate everybody, give them all a PhD, you still wouldn't solve the problem. Harvard University can't educate 18,000 people simultaneously, or 87,000 or 800,000 or 8 million. So you have to dematerialize the professor and dematerialize the experience. So you put it all as streaming on demand, computer generated education. And you create simulations where you need to create simulations, and you upload it. It's like the human condition is being held back by 500,000 well-meaning average algebra teachers. I love them. I mean, please don't take offense if you're an algebra teacher, but instead of 500,000 algebra teachers going through the same motion over and over again, what you need is like 1 or 5 or 10 really good algebra teachers, and they need to do it 1 billion times a day or 1 billion times a year for free. And if we do that, There's no reason why you can't give infinite education, certainly in science, technology, engineering, and math, right? Infinite education to everybody with no constraint. And I think the same is true, right? With just about every other thing. If you want to bring joy to the world, you need digital music. If you want to bring, enlightenment to the world, you need digital education. If you, want to bring anything of consequence in the world, you got to digitally transform it, and then you got to manufacture it something like 100 times more efficiently as a start, but 1,000,000 times more efficiently. It has all sorts of those fundamental engines and materials and techniques that we need to master. And each one of them is a lifetime of experimentation of someone capable of making a seminal contribution to the body of human knowledge.
There are certain problems like education that could be solved through this process of dematerialization. And by the way, to give props to the 500K algebra teachers, when I look at YouTube, for example, one possible approach is each one of those 500,000 teachers probably had days and moments of brilliance. And if they had ability to contribute to in the natural selection process, like the market of education, where the best ones rise up, that's a really interesting way, which is like the best day of your life, the best lesson you've ever taught could be found and sort of broadcast to billions of people. So all of those kinds of ideas can be made real in the digital world. Now, traveling across planets, you still can't solve that problem with dematerialization. What you could solve potentially is dematerializing the human brain, where you can transfer like you don't need to have astronauts on the ship. You can have a floppy disk carrying a human brain.
Touching on those points, you'd love for the 500,000 algebra teachers to become 500,000 math specialists, and maybe they clump into 50,000 specialties as teams, and they all pursue 50,000 new problems, and they put their algebra teaching on autopilot.
Yeah.
That's the same.
Yes.
That's the same as when I give you 11 cents worth of electricity, and you don't have to row a boat 8 hours a day before you can eat. Right.
Yes.
It would be a lot better, that you would pay for your food in the first 8 seconds of your day, and then you could start thinking about other things, right? With regard to technology, one thing that I learned studying technology when you look at S curves is until you start the S curve, you don't know whether you're 100 years from viability, 1,000 years from viability, or a few months from viability.
Mm-hmm.
So,
isn't that fun? That's so fun. The early part of the S curve is so fun because you don't know.
In 1900, you could have got any number of learned academics to give you 10,000 reasons why humans will never fly.
Yeah.
Right? And in 1903, the Wright brothers flew. And by 1969, we're walking on the moon. So the advance that we made in that field was extraordinary. But for the 100 years and 200 years before, they were just back and forth and nobody was close. And that's the happy part. The happy part is we went from flying 20 miles an hour or whatever to flying 25,000 miles an hour in 66 years. The unhappy part is I studied aeronautical engineering at MIT in the 80s. And in the 80s, we had Gulfstream aircraft, we had Boeing 737s, we had the space shuttle. And you fast forward 40 years, and we pretty much had the same exact aircraft. The efficiency of the engines was 20-30% more.
Yeah.
Right? We slammed into a brick wall around 69 to 75. Like, in fact, the Global Express, the Gulfstream, these were all engineered in the 70s, some in the 60s. The actual The fuselage silhouette of a Gulfstream of a G5 was the same shape as a G4, is the same shape as a G3, is the same shape as a G2. And that's because they were afraid to change the shape for 40 years because he that got an aeronautical engineering degree spent his career in software. Like,
Yeah.
why is it that I never a day in my life, with the exception of some Air Force Reserve work, I never got paid to be an aeronautical engineer, and I worked in software engineering my entire
Well,
career.
maybe software engineering is the new aeronautical engineering in some way. Maybe you hit fundamental walls in certain until you have to return to it centuries later. Or no?
The National Gallery of Art was endowed by a very rich man, Andrew Mellon. And you know how he made his money?
Hmm.
Aluminum. Okay. And so, and you know what kind of airplanes you can create without aluminum? Nothing. Right.
So it's a material.
so-
So it's a materials problem.
Okay, so 1900, we made massive advances in metallurgy, right? I mean, that was U.S. Steel, that was iron to steel, aluminum. Massive fortunes were created because this was a massive technical advance. And then we also had the internal combustion engine, and you know, the story of Ford and General Motors and Daimler Chrysler and the like is informed by that. So you have no jet engines, no rocket motors, no